The Institute for the Study of Peak States presents the first International Psychoimmunology and Psychobiology Research Symposium. The Barefoot Counselor, From the Village to the World, presented by Michael St. John.
When Grant was initially talking about having this conference, we mentioned at the start that initially the plan for this was just to be a little get together here in person on Hornby Island, and ideally what we were hoping was we would get a number of researchers all together and collaborating different ideas and sharing experiences. So we were really open to the idea of having people from outside of the Institute come to present. And so obviously this evolved over time. Coronavirus meant we ended up doing this online. And so then we opened this up much more broadly, not just to researchers, but to also other therapists as well. So Michael has many years ago done some of our training. But isn't a certified therapist with us. But in that spirit of wanting other people from outside of the Institute to share their perspectives, and one of the things we were talking about is how do we get kind of breakthroughs out into the world. Michael proposed a topic around his personal experience around how he's got stuff out in the world that he thought might be useful to share. So, Michael, over to you.
All right, thank you. So I entitled the talk, The Barefoot Counselor, From the Village to the World, to give an idea of the scope of my experience and my thought about getting the benefits of the work of the Institute out into the world. This is going to be in two parts. The first part is about incorporating the published ISPS techniques and the rapid trauma healing methods such as EFT and TAT into a pay-for-results counseling practice. If you're not familiar with TAT, it's tapas acupressure technique. And so it's more about holding points than tapping on points. And then the second part is about finding ways to bring the benefits of 3 currently proprietary processes into broad availability, eventually into community practice. And these specifically are the Silent Mind, Inner Peace, and S-Hole processes. So thank you, Mary, for touching on that yesterday with the Inner Peace Project. I was wondering if that was what you had in mind when I saw the title. So I appreciate that I'm not the only one in the world thinking about that. And thank you to Mary and Grant for introducing some of these things like the S-Hole process. And so let's get into this a little bit. So the story of the Barefoot Counselor. I chose that metaphor relating to the concept of the barefoot doctor because I brought this into my world with very few resources. And the story begins back when I was about 22 years old. I was engaged to a woman who was going for a combined master's and doctoral degree in clinical psychology. She was studying at the University of Montana. I was typing up her papers, found it very fascinating. And one day while in the university bookstore, I stumbled upon this particular book. And I was already familiar with the author from his 2 previous books, trusted what he was likely to say, and opened it up, was inspired and excited, looked at the cover, saw that baby in diapers, and the expression you see on that baby is about the expression I had when I thought of bringing that book up to the counter and paying for it. I did not have a very strong sense of my own masculinity back then and was really kind of shaky about having somebody see me buy a book with a baby on the cover. And so I spent at least 20, maybe 30 minutes opening the book, being inspired and excited, closing it, looking at the cover, and being embarrassed. And it went back and forth between excited, embarrassed, excited, embarrassed. Eventually, excitement won out over embarrassment. I bought the book, read it, and it actually turned out to be a very, very useful foundation. It allowed me to better understand what I was typing up for my fiance, better understand the textbooks that she was reading that I would browse through and sometimes read entirely, It also allowed me to get admitted to her afternoon graduate seminars and interact with her graduate cohort and the professor there. So it helped, and after more than 40 years, it is still in print. And Joe Pierce now is unfortunately dead, but his work lives on, and this is kind of a landmark thing. And the chief reason I think it's a landmark, and I'm going to switch to my next slide here, is that it tied developmental psychology to developmental biology. So all this here, yep, wrong control. So that was my foundation, and it turns out it was the exact perfect foundation for understanding the work of the Institute here. And it would be quite some time before I discovered Grant and the Institute. Along the way, I learned family systems theory and figured out how to extend that to social systems generally. I learned about community building as described by Scott Peck through his books, The Different Drum and A World Waiting to Be Born. That gave me a time developmental view of social systems and showed me some really strong parallels to individual development. And it was suggestive of recurrent structural patterns throughout society. And I tend to be a systems thinker and can quickly pick up on patterns that seem to be relatively obscure to other people, at least unless they're pointed out very, very explicitly sometimes. And then about, was in 1993, I learned about the work of Bruce Lipton. And at that time, it was just a recorded radio talk show. And it was one of the most exciting things I had encountered. It was very much like encountering the book Magical Child. And I could quickly pick up on the implications of what was going on in epigenetics and quantum biology as he talked about them. There were extensive developmental, immunological, and evolutionary implications. And so for me, it was like watching a nuclear explosion in reverse. Many things that had just been constant conundrums in conventional theory suddenly started making sense. And over the next 3 years, I made attempts to get both Bruce Lipton and Joe Pierce into a summer camp for adults and families that was organized around creating community and intimacy in relationships. And Bruce was very quick to accept the invitation. Joe was kind of reluctant until I mentioned that, oh, by the way, we're bringing Bruce Lipton in. And then he just lit up and said, all right, I'm there. And so in 1998, August, those two met for the first time ever. And that's the feather in my cap. I was the one who took the initiative for that. And out of that meeting came Bruce's first book, The Biology of Belief, and Joe Pierce's seventh book, The Biology of Transcendence. And they kind of helped each other out writing these particular books. And then that kind of set the stage and primed me for eventually in 2004, meeting Grant for the second time and finally learning what he was up to and being really excited about that. Some people in the group I was with organized a training later. It's like a month later. I was low on money, couldn't afford it at the time, was reluctant to borrow. I kind of shot myself in the foot on that occasion. And so I lived with that and moved on anyway, because I wasn't ultimately willing to let the lack of money keep me away from this. Along the way, I learned, once I discovered more about the tribal block phenomenon, apparently I was not much affected by that. And so one of the consequences is I'm not the sort to cling to any particular paradigm. I'm not inclined to put others that I respect highly up on a pedestal. And people are just people, and we're all imperfect in our various ways. And probably separate from that, I'm also very intellectually adventurous, and somehow I seem to have a good sense of what's likely to be viable. What I'm sharing with you here, and I'm just going to really jet through this. So this is something that can be made available for later. And I had to learn the models of the Institute to be able to do counseling work really effectively. I'd started that back when I was about 32 years old, and was good enough that people would actually pay me twice what I asked for voluntarily. But it was an avocation, and I never tried to make a living off of it. When I started learning the peak state stuff and what I think of as power healing techniques, such as EFT and TAT, I just put everything on a free basis, just so I could build skill and not have to worry about client satisfaction. And so, I learned the developmental events model, which was just an expansion of what I already had. I didn't have to shift paradigms. And the important thing there that Grant discovered early on was that when trauma occurs at particular developmental events, it can have some pretty widespread effects. And it's not so much the content of the trauma as when it happens. And so some well-known developmental events are conception and implantation. And as named by the Institute, there are peak states associated with each. So inner peace for conception, underlying for happiness for implantation. And there are currently, I think, over 4 dozen states cataloged, and probably some more that haven't yet been cataloged. And the Triune brain model, I talk to my clients about it as the extended Triune brain model, because we do talk about more than just 3 brains, but the core 3, as Shane mentioned, are the mind, the heart, and the body. And there is some kind of parallel between the central nervous system, what's now known as the cardiac nervous system, and what is now known as the enteric nervous system. And so that I use that to help people understand that our subconscious is actually not one thing, but many things. And then there's the primary cell model, and so the brains, as they're sometimes called in the subconscious, have been found to have relationships to organelles or classes of organelles in the primary cell. And the primary cell discovery was a really amazing thing that occurred for Grant, and it allowed just unusual and really otherwise impossible strides forward. The transpersonal biology model basically says that many spiritual experiences are actually perceptual overlays of primary cell events, and it allows a bridge among biology, psychology, and spirituality. That, when I came upon it, was also very exciting, because in the work of Joe Pierce, he tries to bridge all 3 himself. And so again, I was kind of primed for that when I found it. The pathogenic microorganism model isn't, I haven't seen that articulated in so many words, but when I talk to my clients about that, it's that we have somatic parasites that many of us know about, and then cellular parasites we normally only think of as viruses, but it's now known that other types of organisms can get inside the cell and cause various kinds of dysfunction. But in the primary cell, that range is really extreme, from barely noticeable to developmental arrest or regression in children with autism. And of course, the Institute has developed several techniques to eliminate some of these and is working on still more. The optimal function model, not typically articulated as a model, but basically it says that each peak state, also now including each state of immunity, is an expression of one or more areas of optimal primary cell function. And again, this is not something that the Institute has articulated, but as I talk to my clients, I talk about the differential treatment model, which is basically that based on the cause of the problem, there are specific treatments. And so we're not just looking at the symptoms, but looking at the cause and addressing the cause. The next 2, again, I talk about, they're not things that the Institute, to my knowledge, has articulated as such. But the complete treatment model is that the treatment is designed to completely and permanently eliminate the underlying cause of the presenting symptoms, so that no ongoing practices are necessary to maintain the results obtained. That's something that many people look at and it's like, oh my God, how is that even possible? And then there's the complete reliability model, and it's my articulation of it, but it's a short phrasing of what Grant was talking about yesterday, where the goal of the research and development is to produce processes and techniques that work 100% on all occasions, and that's a really good engineering approach. And part of what appealed to me about what the Institute is up to is my background is in physical sciences and engineering. So, you know, I didn't work in engineering, but I got enough of the training that I have a really thorough appreciation for the approach that Grant has taken in the research, and for the work that the whole crew of people in research has done on this. And so, there's a quote I like from Grant that, for a therapy technique, healing is the goal, and for a peak state technique, healing is the tool. And this, of course, is now extended to psychoimmunology. So when I talk to my clients, that's the sort of thing that I'm trying to get across to them, that this is it's a whole other universe in terms of trying to get any kind of healing or doing personal growth. And I don't have a beautiful view of an outdoor scene from my room here, so I'm going to treat you to this for a little bit. And I think what I might do is, how do I stop the sharing? So I want to take a few minutes, and I'm going to have to blast through this thing. I started, I guess, a little late. But I want to tell you a little bit about the how I have experienced integrating all of this into a counseling practice and doing it on a charge for results basis. One of the luxuries I've had is not having to demand that this practice support me and pay my bills. So it's allowed me to focus heavily on the quality of the service. And so, I'm able to also work for longer periods with my clients. 2 hours is kind of typical. 4 or 5 hours may actually occur in a single session. And some of the things I can address now include prenatal traumas, something perhaps as prosaic as the mom was in a car accident and got bumped pretty badly. And so the guy I was working with at the time, he was 35. He knew that accident occurred and was pretty sure it affected him, but he wasn't quite sure how or how much. So he did the work. And what we discovered, that he had a lot of underlying anger around that incident that just suddenly got drained. And he found he was, much happier a lot of the time. And it certainly made him much easier to be around for his then fiance, and they've since gotten married. I've also, had to work with the caveat that in healing something in a client, I would do well to have the same thing healed in myself. And so I recently had a client who had known problems in the near and extended postnatal period, just being separated from her mother, being poked and prodded by the doctors, trying to get her APGAR scores up. And I thought, I might have a similar problem myself. So I went and did the work on myself, and yes, things changed. I became much less resistant to people kind of making demands on me, on my time and energy, just wanting extensive involvement when I didn't have a lot of inner resources. The other kind of even more surprising thing is that I experienced a postural change in my upper back. It turns out I had a micro slouch, and that's gone. I can go on more about that, and this is usually like a 2-hour talk, and I'm trying to jam it all into half an hour. So what I'm going to do is move into the next section, and here we go. And oh, come on here. So reaching out to the world. So this is taking it from the microcosm to the macrocosm in a really big and fast way. So yesterday we talked about owning the problem rather than the solution. And that's kind of the approach I've had pretty much from the beginning, taking the counseling practice out and keeping it pretty much as an avocation so I could focus on the quality of the service. And then in looking at what all of us can do. And the thing is, because I'm talking about processes that are currently restricted to certified practitioners. Some of them are restricted to clinic practitioners. It may be a while before these can be broadly available, but my sense of it, having gone through some of these processes myself, actually all 3 of these, is that they probably can, in some instances, be sufficiently safety tested and work through to where somebody who is just a lower level certified practitioner, or maybe even somebody like me who doesn't yet have the certification, can go out into the world and bring these to the general public. So the particular three that I'd like to get out is silent mind process. Actually, let me go back. So what I'm looking for as an effect here is to reduce chronic suffering related to structural and interpersonal conflict and unhealed trauma. So structural conflict has to do with structures in society, in the workplace, for example, between people in government, between nation states and ethnic groups. And my focus in this case is high impact areas of society. So this is where I think it's likely to have the greatest impact. So looking at the silent mind process, I'm not going to go and read the definitions here. You got a lot of that yesterday, and again, the written part can be made available afterward. And I'm running out of time. So I do want to kind of underline that for the silent mind process, pretty much everyone can benefit in some way because that underlying problem is so extremely widespread. If I remember correctly, Grant or someone said that it's so ubiquitous that not only did they find the problem in everyone they've looked at, they've found the problem in every bird and mammal species they have looked at. So it's it's endemic and not just pandemic. With the inner peace process, at least 90% can benefit to some degree, and 10% or less who don't benefit so much don't benefit because they've already got it. They're already there. And then, with the S-hole process, my understanding is that at least 50 to 70% can benefit from that. And again, the others who don't benefit just don't have the problem. So this is a way to get something out that has very broad applicability. My long-term goal, and it's probably very long-term, is that these would be offered and delivered within the first month of life, offered to parents of newborns, and then eventually to all others as the delivery system expands to accommodate the volume. I find it kind of ironic that today newborns get 2 vaccinations within the first 24 hours of life. And I could share my thoughts and feelings about that, but I just want to offer that as a contrast. And then, so in looking at how to select which groups, I'm trying to find is groups, professions with high contact and or high intensity interactions. And this, from my perspective, yields a high impact. And so that these would be high impact and high benefit areas of society. And because of things being what they are, my thought is start small and start locally and start with personal connections. And these may be 1 to 3 or 4 people removed from the primary contact. And as we may have picked up yesterday, don't try to use an elevator speech. It's too big a topic to try to fit into an elevator speech. But do share the excitement and the possibility, especially around how these things would address important issues and problems from the perspective of the people you're addressing. If you look at it from their perspective, it's like, hey, I see, you've got a problem here you're trying to address, and stand side by side with them rather than face to face. It's it's a metaphor, but it helps you to understand and helps them to understand that you're pretty much on their side there. And next, is when there's an organization involved, to address the administrative issues in a similar manner. Some little aphorisms that I like to remember in doing this is that when you know little about something, it's very easy to believe you know much more than you actually do. If you were present yesterday and you heard Grant's talk, part of Grant's talk about how when they discovered the primary cell state and they found the seaweed-like stuff on what looked like an ocean floor, and they started pulling it out. They didn't know as much as they thought they did, and well, they discovered that they had caused themselves some problems. So, that's one example. Way back in the 1800s, there was, I'm forgetting the name right now, but there's somebody who's very well respected in the sciences and biology, and he made this, very wide, sweeping declaration that cells are just these bags of amorphous protoplasm and really not all that interesting. No need to study them. And here we are, 100-some years later, and the cell is almost infinitely fascinating. And then the road to success is often paved with failure. And the thing there is that this, it's framing failure. It's feedback. It's not defeat. If you look at the research process that Grant described yesterday, if you look carefully, it's probably more than 99% failure. But each failure is feedback, and when you get to the final process or technique, every step along that road is well worth it. The other thing is that persistence and patience do pay off. An example out of my life is that it took 3 years, but after 3 years, I actually got Joe Pierce and Bruce Lipton together for the first time ever. So I want to just reintroduce this graph about early adopters, the early majority, late majority. I think they were introduced as, the early majority was introduced as followers and the late majority was introduced as late adopters, and that was the language I ended up incorporating into my text here. And so this is the last page, and I'm pretty much going to skip over it for time's sake, I think. But I wanted to at least address the beginning of it, in that my sense of things is that even though there may be some logistical difficulties in some aspects, getting it in at the level of low-level birth attendants, such as doulas and midwives, could be very useful. But the nurse midwives and obstetricians will tend to be much later because of the professional culture in which they have to operate. And my thought is that initially it's just for the professionals themselves, so they can see how it impacts their service. When they don't have the problems brought about by the tribal block, the mind chatter, all the past trauma still chattering in the present moment, and any problems brought about by the S-hole condition, they can be much, much more present for their clients, their mothers, the children being born, the fathers, when those are involved. And from there, my suspicion is that they're going to want to see this made available for the newborns. And so I'm getting flagged for something here, it looks like. And I'm going to pop out to see if, see, I can't tell right now. Let me double check. I am a few minutes over time is what it looks like. So, Shane, should I wind up? Should I take questions? And I see your mouth moving.
Yeah, sorry.
Now I can hear you.
Just a minute to wrap it up, and then we'll have to move to the next speaker.
Okay. So I'm going to touch briefly on the very bottom one. And it looks like it's a little grandiose. I'm talking about reaching into microstates, such as Monaco or Liechtenstein, Andorra. And it's a funny thing, but I discovered that I am one person removed from the Prince of Monaco. I don't think I would ever dare to reach out through that one person unless some other pretty major things happen. But we may be closer than we imagine ourselves to being to that kind of contact. And so are there thoughts, questions? I can maybe take one or two.
At the moment, there's not, and we're probably at the time where we probably need to move to the next speaker as well.
Okay,
so thank you. As you said, you're trying to squeeze 2 hours into a 30-minute presentation. So thanks for your time, Michael.
Thank you, everyone.
And if you can just respond to any questions that come through in a written fashion, that'd be great.
Okay, I'll do that.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for watching. For more information, please visit www.pigstates.com and subscribe to our YouTube channel.